Hello, and welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Hodeling, FranklinCovey's head of product. In On Leadership, we meet with many of the world's greatest leaders to learn about the mistakes, mindsets, and methods that help them become the people they are today. We hope that learning from their hard-earned insights will help you accelerate your own leadership journey. Today's guest is Charles Duhigg. Charles Duhigg is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and the author of multiple best-selling books, including The Power of Habit and more recently, Supercommunicators. In today's conversation, we'll discuss how you can create sustainable habits, the habits that Charles has developed and struggled to sustain over time, the keys to being a world-class communicator, and some of the most impactful and important articles he's written in his long journalistic career. Charles Duhigg, welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership.
Thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Wonderful. I'm very excited about today's conversation. I still remember I listened to The Power of Habit as one of the first ever audiobooks that I listened to 12, 13 years or so ago. And I loved it then, and I still think about cue, routine, reward today. So it's wonderful to be able to speak all these years later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely lovely. So at FranklinCovey, we focus on leadership development happening inside out and how it really matters who you are, then how you think, and then what you do. And so I actually want to start with a little bit of background and bio on yourself. You are the seventh of 10 children. You grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then you went on to this illustrious career that we'll get into and talk about today. So I'm curious about how did growing up as one of 10 children in Albuquerque shape who you are today as a person, and then also shape your professional journey?
Well, I think when you have that many siblings, communication matters a lot. And in fact, my latest book, Supercommunicators, is actually about the science of communication. And I think in part, it came out of growing up in a situation where, you know, not only communicating with your siblings is important, right? And anyone who has a sibling knows that there are communication ups and communication downs, but also just at the dinner table, there's a lot of people competing for your parents' attention. And so knowing how to make that connection, knowing how to really forge that relationship, that was really important to me.
Well, I'm one of two, and so I did not have to battle for as many minutes of conversation, but even so, communication is super valuable for all of us. So you left Albuquerque, New Mexico, you went to Yale for undergrad, then you worked on a medical startup, and then private equity, and then ultimately you went to Harvard Business School. Very interestingly, when leaving Harvard Business School, many of your classmates probably going back into private equity or consulting or finance or industry, you decided to be a journalist. What drove you to become a journalist coming out of business school?
Well, it was a 2-year program, and the summer between your first and second year, you're supposed to work for the company that you hope hires you. So I went to work for this private equity real estate firm. And what I would do every day is I would sit down and I would build models to try and figure out which buildings we should put an offer in or not. And I got better and better and better at building models, but it was kind of boring, right? Like every day I'd let myself listen to one episode of This American Life on the computer. And like, that was the best part of my day. And when I got to the end of the summer, I figured, if the best part of my day is listening to This American Life, I should probably go make stories rather than make spreadsheets. And I think for me, the realization that came up was that in business, largely when you're the first 10 years you're in business, you're trying to learn to do one thing better and better and better and better. Whereas when you're a journalist, you are trying to do a different thing every single day. Your job as a journalist is basically to learn and then to figure out how to tell that information in a story that people want to listen to. And I felt like that was fascinating, and I felt like it would fascinate me for the rest of my life. And so I decided to become a journalist. I was the lowest paid member of my class for the first 7 years after we graduated, but I really enjoyed it.
I love that anecdote. I think it's a powerful lesson of the things we do on our break time should be guiding potentially what we do during our main time. I think about my own summer internship in college working in consulting, and every single break I had, I would read TechCrunch about tech startups, and I realized not fit to work in a consulting firm. I ended up deciding to go on and start my own company instead. And so that anecdote really resonated with me. How did moving into journalism with an MBA hurt and help you? What about your business background accelerated your career and abilities, and what about it held you back?
Well, I think it really only helped me. First of all, it helped me get my first job because it was somewhat unusual for someone with an MBA to apply to become a newspaper reporter. But secondly, I love writing about business. I mean, I've written about business my whole life, and I think business stories are fascinating. And knowing the vocabulary of business, right? Having some familiarity and ease with how finances work and financial ratios and how different players, input into buying and selling businesses and running them. I think it's really, really helped. So I'm anyone who's thinking of becoming a journalist, I would urge you not necessarily to get an MBA, but to go study something that you want to write about, because it makes you so much better as a writer on that topic.
That's great advice. In your journalism career, you've been prolific. You've won a number of awards, including winning a Pulitzer Prize. Congratulations! While you're working for the New York Times, writing a series about Apple and kind of Apple as a case study for the new global economy. In that piece afterwards, I've heard you say that Foxconn ended up raising wages for millions of workers and generating hundreds of millions of dollars of kind of impact to the employee population. So congratulations for really writing a piece that then had an immediate impact in the world. That obviously generated a lot of kudos. What are an example of another article that you've written in your career that you really enjoyed working on that maybe isn't quite as well known or celebrated?
Yeah, so I when I did the Apple series, I was at the New York Times, and now I'm a writer for the New Yorker. And the thing that's interesting about New Yorker pieces is I often spend 4 to 6 months reporting and writing them. They're just really, really in-depth pieces, as anyone who's a New Yorker reader knows. And there's been a couple of pieces that I've written.
Some might say too in-depth, but that's a
depending on your taste. Exactly.
I love it. I love it. Totally.
One of the pieces, the first piece that I wrote for the New Yorker was about this trial that was happening. I don't know if folks remember this, where Waymo, which is the self-driving car division of Google, sued Uber because Uber had hired this guy who used to work for Waymo, and they said he had stolen secrets.
Anthony Lewandowski, is that
the yeah, exactly. You remember
in the
Anthony
recesses
Lewandowski.
Of my brain? Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what's fascinating about it was that it sort of opened up this corporate espionage, stealing corporate secrets, what are known as trade secrets within the law, is this really fascinating question, because what is a trade secret, right? If I file a patent on something, it's no longer a trade secret, but I get monopoly protection on it for a while. But if I don't file that patent and I keep it secret, then no one else can figure out what I'm doing. And so understanding what was going on, and Lewandowski ended up getting arrested and convicted. He got pardoned by Trump and Trump's first administration. It's a really, really interesting story. And at the core of it is self-driving cars, which is a potentially world-changing technology, but one that's very, very slow to be realized.
Yeah. Are there any pieces that you've written that have cost you a lot, emotionally, physically, relationally, that really took a lot out of you? Part of being investigative journalism, as you said, is you're spending 3 to 6 months diving in to a topic area. What have you written that has really kind of stuck with you, potentially in a hard way?
Well, I was a correspondent in Iraq for a little while during the war, and that was obviously very hard just because you're sort of surrounded by death. But I would say in general, so I have sort of two different attitudes about writing. One is that when I'm writing for the newspaper or I'm writing for a magazine, it's really, I want it to be investigative. Like, it should be something that, like, not necessarily that many people read, but that the people who read are the important people on that topic, and that it convinces them to change how they behave. But then when I write books, it's exactly the opposite. I want to write a book that at least 1 million people want to read, and also helps them change their behavior. And so my books tend to be much more positive than my news writing, because I'm trying to share knowledge about how to become better, as opposed to exposing what's wrong with the world. And so I would say that that both contain their challenges, right? The hardest thing about writing is figuring out what the right story is. And it often just takes a lot of time to find it.
Yeah. So I want to continue on that thread about the transition from writing articles to writing books. You wrote The Power of Habit back, I think it was 2012, 2013. Yeah. What convinced you this is the topic for me to really sink my teeth into? You had written so many pieces that are, 5 pages, 10 pages, and now you're like, I got 300 pages in me.
Right.
Why habit?
Well, I think a big part of it was that most of the books I write start with me having a problem that I want to solve. So, right. So, my first son had just been born, and anyone who's like had a kid knows, like, it's just so hard to do everything that first year, right? Like, it's hard to get up and exercise. It's hard to make yourself send that extra email late at night. And so I was like, look, if I'm so smart, why is it so hard for me to eat healthily? Why is it so hard for me to get up and go for a run in the morning? Like, I should be better than this. And so I said, like, look, I'm going to call all these experts who are experts on habit formation, and I'm going to ask them how I can get better at this. But nobody wants to talk to just one person. So I'll say, look, I'm writing a book about trying to understand how to have better habits, which was true. I had already sold the book, but it seemed like a question that I wanted to answer for myself. The same is true of Supercommunicators. The reason I wrote it was because I found I kept on falling into these traps where I was miscommunicating, where I was saying the wrong thing or not hearing entirely what a person was trying to tell me. And so I really just wanted to talk to experts to understand, how do I get better at communication? And in doing so, hopefully learn enough interesting information to share it with readers.
That's one of the parts of this podcast that I enjoy the most, is the luxury of being able to have conversations with the people that I would be itching to speak to anyways, but because it's under the auspices of a podcast, they're willing to come on and chat.
Exactly.
So you had the same luxury by writing a book. My mom is actually an author, and she says she writes what she knows. She writes family books about parenting and about sibling relationships and whatnot. And so similarly, kind of writing to work on the issues in her life that are kind of natural for her. It sounds like you had a similar motivation there, which is fascinating.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge part of it.
So in Power of Habit, you talk about kind of this habit cycle of cue, routine, reward, and then keystone habits. Maybe just for the 1% of listeners who haven't read the book, maybe explain to them the kind of foundational model of the Power of Habit.
Yeah.
And how they can apply it in their life.
So I think that most people think of a habit as being one thing, right? I always eat a donut when I pass by the break room, even though I don't want to. Or I manage to get up every morning and go running, or 3 times a week. But actually, every habit has 3 components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for the automatic behavior to unfold. And then there's the routine, which is the behavior itself. And then finally, a reward. Every habit in our life has a reward. And that reward is what causes your brain to say, oh, I'm going to make this into a little chunk. I'm going to connect the cue, routine, and reward and make this easier and easier and easier to do. Now, about 40 to 45% of what we do every day is a habit. We might think of them as decisions, but we're doing it habitually. This comes from research by Wendy Wood, who's at USC. And every single time you do that, every time you back the car out of the driveway without having to think about it too hard, every time you walk into the cafeteria, and even though you said, I'm going to get a salad today for lunch, you walk over and you get one of the less healthy sandwiches. What's happening there is that there is some cue to trigger that automatic behavior. And when we are in the grip of a habit, our brain kind of turns off a little bit. And then it's delivering some reward to us, whether that be a tasty sandwich or the satisfaction we hardly even notice of getting the car into the street out of the driveway safely. That cue and reward are really important. And what we've discovered is that rather than focusing on the routine, the behavior, if you focus on the cue and the reward, then you have much more power over what habits you possess.
I have found in my own life, and I've used your cue, routine, reward guide, I have found that it's very helpful to start new habits, and then eventually I fade out. And after, whether it's a month or 6 months or whatnot, the habit dissipates. What is your advice to people to sustain habits over a really long period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one thing I'll say is you definitely have lots of habits that haven't faded out, but we don't even think of them as habits, right? Do you brush your teeth every morning?
I do.
Okay, so that's a habit, right? And you probably
Is now the moment I'm going to admit that I don't? No, I do.
So there's lots of things that we do habitually that again, because our brain turns off, we don't even think of it as a habit. But you're right. There are some habits that at first are really easy to implement and then they fade away. And what's happening there is oftentimes that the reward isn't truly rewarding, or that the satisfaction of the reward wears off over time. So take people who exercise. What we found is that if you want to start an exercise routine, it's really helpful at the beginning when you first are establishing that routine to give yourself a small reward whenever you exercise. So if you go to the gym, have a smoothie right afterwards, right? That tastes really good. If you go for a run, give yourself 2 pieces of chocolate to eat. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to trick our brain into creating a habit by associating a reward with this cue and this routine. But over time, what we find is that people kind of get bored of chocolate, or they get bored of the smoothie, right? If they don't change the ingredients. And so one of 2 things happens. Either people who are smart about this, they'll vary the rewards that they give themselves because they want that reward to remain rewarding. But equally, oftentimes the reward becomes internal instead of external, right? When you run, your brain releases all these endorphins and endocannabinoids and other things that make us feel good. And the first couple times you go for a run, you don't really feel that or believe it. But by the 10th or 11th time you're going for a run, you've learned that you feel really good afterwards. And that reward, the good feeling, the intrinsic reward, as opposed to the extrinsic reward, becomes the thing that motivates you to act. And so the key to making a habit stick is, first of all, make sure that your rewards are actually rewarding and that they stay rewarding, and change them if they are no longer rewarding, but also try and move from an external reward to an internal reward. That pay attention to that good feeling you have after running, or keep on your wall a calendar where you put an X every day that you go for a run, and let yourself feel a real sense of pride from all those X's on the calendar. That's the kind of thing that makes a habit consistent.
It must be challenging as the habit guy. All of your friends are probably like, you must have the best habits, and you've stuck with all these habits over time, but you're a human like the rest of us. And I'm sure you've dropped in and out of various habits.
Oh, absolutely.
What are the habits since writing the book what's a habit you've been able to keep that you're really proud of, that you've done for a long time now? And then what's a habit you're kind of constantly striving to maintain?
Well, so one habit that, is exercise. Like, one of the things that I discovered, I'm kind of one of those people who never exercised when I was young, and learning to exercise and letting it become a habit, whether it be running or lifting weights, that's been a really great habit. Because what I find is that once you're on, exercise can be kind of boring, right? But once you're doing it on autopilot, it gives your brain all this time to think about other stuff. You can listen to audiobooks or podcasts or music. You can think about, the coming week and how you're going to spend it. And so that's been great. A habit that I struggle with a lot is honestly sometimes being present, right? So because I love to think and I love learning, oftentimes when I'm just in the car with my wife, my brain will kind of go to a place to think about, like, what's going on next week, or how am I going to write this article, or what does this mean or that mean? And one of the things that I try and spend more time doing is just being in the moment and being present, which is a habit, because it's something that feels really, really rewarding. And I know that it makes my life richer.
What is your cue, routine, and reward for being present?
So the cue is that when I feel myself not being present, what I do is I take a breath. I hold it for just a second or two at the top of the breath. And sometimes I'll close my eyes. If I'm driving, I don't close my eyes. But sometimes I'll close my eyes and I'll just think to myself, be here. And then that kind of helps. That kind of helps me just focus on what's going on around me, listening to the noises around me, listening to my wife, listening to my kids, enjoying the view out the window. And the reward that I give myself is that when I do that, I really compliment myself. Again, just in my head, like, you did great. Maybe it only lasted a second or two. Maybe it lasted for a minute, but you did a really good job of being in the moment. and of really noticing the things that you want to notice. So many of our habits are mental habits, and they're things that we develop and that we cultivate within our own heads. And being present is certainly one of them.
It's been 12, 13 years since you published the book. If you were to re-release and write an updated version of it, what would you change most notably about it?
I don't think I'd change much, but I would add a chapter on neuroplasticity. We have learned so much in the last decade about how neuroplasticity works, and it's really, really interesting, right? What we've learned is that there are points in our lives when neuroplasticity is more flexible or less flexible. Obviously, when you're a baby, you have amazing neuroplasticity. When you're a child, you have a lot of neuroplasticity. That's why learning a language as a child is so much easier than learning it as an adult. But then it turns out that once you're an adult, there's also these moments when neuroplasticity goes up. For instance, when there's a big change in your life, you move from one city to another, you get married or you get divorced or you have kids. Suddenly your neuroplasticity becomes much, much more flexible. And it's at those moments that you can create new habits that it really will stick with you. And so part of what I would write about is looking for those moments in life and how to recognize those moments in your life when your neuroplasticity extends.
What's the most recent moment for you?
So we're actually moving today, like literally.
Oh my gosh!
Outside of my door, the movers are
and
here.
You're on the podcast. Bless
I'm on the
you.
podcast.
Bless your wife and family for allowing it to happen.
This is
unbelievable.
my
Moving
one
days
break
are so stressful.
for the day. Yeah. So I'm guessing that like when we move to the new house, that there's going to be this period of neuroplasticity, and we're moving to a new neighborhood, and I'm surrounded by new cues and potentially new rewards. And so if I want to start a running routine, then like starting it tomorrow from the new house will be a lot easier than starting it today from this place where I've lived for 5 years now.
Well, congratulations on the move.
Thanks.
I expect that right now you're probably wearing like gym shorts beneath the camera as you're picking up boxes and whatnot. So good luck on the move the rest of the day. I would love to transition from talking about Power of Habit to your most recent book, Supercommunicator. Supercommunicator is another bestseller, was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly a year. And I think, as is the case with many great books, it introduces a new frame that allows you to see the world in a new way. For me, the really powerful frame was the 3 types of conversations and recognizing when you're in which. And so do you mind sharing that framework with our
absolutely.
listeners?
So oftentimes when we're having a conversation, we think we know what that discussion is about, right? We're talking about my book or where to go on vacation next year or the budget. But actually what researchers have seen, particularly neuroscientists, when they can study people's brains in conversations, is that during a discussion, people are having many different kinds of conversations. And these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There are these practical conversations where we're making plans together or we're solving problems. But then there's also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling. And I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then finally, there's social conversations about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society, how we see ourselves and how others see us. And what researchers have discovered is that all 3 of those kinds of conversations are all equally legitimate. And in fact, you'll probably have all 3 different kinds of conversations in a discussion. But if people aren't having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then they're like 2 ships passing in a night. They can't fully hear each other. For instance, I would come home from work and I'd start complaining about my day. And my wife would say, oh, here's a solution. Take your boss out to lunch so you can get to know each other better. But instead of listening to her advice, I'd get even more upset and say, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side, right? It's because I was having an emotional conversation and she was having a practical conversation. And it's only once you're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, what's known in psychology as the matching principle, it's only then that you can fully hear with each other and that you feel connected to each other.
Yeah, it's really powerful advice. I think it's similar. I've heard, I think it's Esther Perel say before, when you're in a fight, you need to ask yourself, what are we really fighting about? You're not fighting about who's taking out the trash. You're fighting something deeper about responsibilities and selflessness and selfishness, et cetera. And so I think it's a really great framing. Another concept in Supercommunicators that you talk about is looping for understanding, where when you're speaking with somebody, to be an active listener, to repeat back what you're hearing, make sure that you've understood it, and then they feel heard. How do you do that in a way that doesn't seem inauthentic or doesn't seem formulaic? I found in conversations when I do that intentionally, it feels stilted and uncomfortable, that they're like, oh, why does he keep repeating back to me? So what's your kind of advice there?
So I think the key there, so let's just go over what looping for understanding is. One of the things that we know is that it's not important just to listen to someone. It's important to show them that you're listening, right? Because there's oftentimes this little suspicion in the back of our head, this person isn't actually listening to me. They're just waiting their turn to speak. So we need to show someone that we're paying attention, particularly in tough conversations. And so looping for understanding is a method for that. It has 3 steps. Step 1 is you ask a question. Step 2 is you repeat back what you heard the person say in your own words, or you ask a follow-up question. You say something that shows them that you were actually listening and thinking about what they said to you. And then step 3, and this is the step I always forget, is ask if you got it right. Did I hear you correctly? Because in that moment, what we're doing is we're asking them to acknowledge that we were listening. Now, oftentimes, if it feels stilted, it's probably because you're just mimicking what the person said, right? You're not showing them, you're not proving to them that you're thinking about it. They said, oh, I want to get salad for lunch. And you say, oh, it sounds like you want to have salad for lunch, right? Of course that's
Totally.
But if you say like, oh, are you trying to be healthy? Like, are you starting on a new health kick? Like, what's going on there? That doesn't sound stilted, but it shows that you're paying attention. It shows that you are listening to them. And that can be really powerful, particularly if we're in a conflict with someone. In conflict, studies show looping for understanding is the single best tactic to help lower the temperature of the conflict.
And why is that? Why do we respond so positively to when somebody loops for us?
Because we want to be heard. We want someone to listen to us, and this is proof that they are listening to us, and that's really, really powerful. I mean, think about how many fights you've been in where you think to yourself, oh, this person just isn't listening to me. Like, I keep on trying to tell them my side of this perspective, and all they do is respond with their side. But if they take a moment and they say, look, here's what I hear you saying. I hear you saying you're really, really frustrated. And you didn't say this exactly, but what I'm inferring is that you're frustrated because I'm late a lot of the time. And I want you to know, I understand that frustration. Like it makes me crazy when people are late, and I'm sorry to be late. Did I get that right? But let me tell you my perspective on it. But before I do, did I get that right? Am I hearing you correctly? At that moment, what you're doing is you're proving that you're listening, and the other person becomes much more likely to listen to you and respond.
I find that listening is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly important, and it's a hard thing to teach people to want to do. So, in Supercommunicators, I'm sure a lot of people read Supercommunicators and think, oh, I wish I were a better presenter and I wish I were more charismatic. I don't know if a lot of people go into it thinking, I want to be a better listener. How do you encourage, drive, motivate, inspire people to be great listeners? Because it's so important.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting is if you want to be a better presenter, if you want to be more charismatic, listening more is the right path, right? One of the things that we know about charisma is that when we're talking to someone who's charismatic, it's not because they're so great. It's because they help make us feel great, right? And the way that they make us feel great, otherwise they come off as like a blowhard or sort of like someone who's just self-interested.
Totally.
The way that they make us feel great is often listening to us. So the way that I would motivate people to become better listeners is to say, oftentimes, if your goal is to be a better manager, if your goal is to do better on a stage, if your goal is to be more charismatic, to be more likable, to have more friends, listening is oftentimes one of the most powerful tools in achieving that goal. And so learning how to listen is the way that we become more charismatic or make more friends.
Yeah, that foundational empathy is the empathy is the foundation to being a better communicator, being a better speaker, et cetera. I totally agree. The final frame that I want to bring up from the book is about feelings, not facts questions. I think it's another great shorthand about how to be a good communicator and how to connect effectively. So maybe if you could explain to our listeners what do you mean by ask feelings, not facts questions? And then a lot of people want to dive deeper, but feel uncomfortable asking those types of questions. How do you get people to get over that hesitation?
So one of the things that researchers have found is that there are kind of two different kinds of conversations, and not all two different kinds of questions, and not all questions are created equal. So there are surface questions where I ask you, how's your day? Or where do you work? I ask you about the facts of your life. And then there are what are known as deep questions, which ask about your values or your beliefs or your experiences. And that can sound kind of intimidating, but it's actually very easy to do. So for instance, if I was to ask you, what do you do for a living? And you say, oh, I'm a doctor. I could ask another fact question. I could say, oh, what hospital do you work at? Or I could say, oh, what made you decide to become a doctor? Like, is that what you always wanted to be? That second question, it's just as easy to ask, but it's a deep question because it's really asking you about your experiences. It gives you a chance to talk about your values, why you became a doctor, what you like about it. So almost any question can be made into a deep question, and it's not going to feel overly intrusive. It's not going to feel like I'm TMI. But when we do that, what happens is that we invite the other person to tell us who they really are. And that's the beginnings of a real conversation.
These skills from Supercommunicator that you've outlined here, these mindsets, are these things that you personally have always excelled at, or was part of writing this book also your own exploration into becoming a better communicator?
Absolutely. No, like I wrote the book because I wanted to be a better communicator, and I try and practice these things every day. And in fact, one of the things we know is that no one is born a super communicator, right? We all learn to become super communicators because communication is just a set of skills. And the more we practice those skills and the more we get comfortable with them, the better we are at them. In fact, if you talk to some of the best communicators and you ask them, were you always this good at communication? They inevitably say no. They say things like, in high school, I had real trouble making friends. And so I really had to study how kids talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced when I was young and I had to be the peacemaker between them. The people who are best at communication are the people who think about communication. And so the more that we do, the better we get.
I think that quick line, and the people who are the best communicating, people who think about communicating, probably can apply to all parts of our life, and the importance of intentionality and kind of thinking very concretely about the way that we want to show up. So thank you for walking through that. I now want to move to close towards our lightning round. A few quick questions for you. First question for you. What is your favorite conversational opener with a stranger on an airplane? I'm guessing not what do you do for work?
Well, actually it is. But
it is. Okay.
There's a second question. Oftentimes, if we're on an airplane, I'll often say, oh, I don't have to ask the first question because we're both going to the same place. And so I'll often say, why are you going to San Diego? Oh, my kids live there. Oh, that's amazing. And then I might ask a fact question. How old are your kids? Oh, they're 24 and 29. Oh, what's it like having adult children like that? Because they're not really adults yet, right? They're still in their 20s, but they are kind of adults. Like, what's that like? So what I try and do is, if I have to, I ask a fact question first. What do you do for a living? Where are you going? Where are you from? But then my second question is always a deep question, which is a why question. Why are you going to San Diego? What's it like to raise children who are in their 20s? That's how I break through.
Wonderful. Second, the person who wrote the book on habits, what habit do you think that every leader in America should adopt tomorrow?
I think asking more questions. Like, one of the things that we know is that employees really like it when their boss asks them questions. And oftentimes when we're a boss, we think our job is not to ask questions, it's to have the answers. But actually what we know is that the best leaders are the people who oftentimes ask the most questions.
Final lightning round question. You live in Santa Cruz. I'm sure you drive to SFO Airport regularly. On the route to the airport, there are tons of billboards about different AI startups and enterprise software, et cetera. Let's say you got one of those billboards and you could put anything on it you wanted. What would you write on the billboard?
I would probably write something like, have a great conversation with someone you disagree with today, And instead of trying to win, try to understand. That's a lot of words for a billboard. So maybe I'd be
But
able
there's
to break it
traffic
down.
there. So it's
Yeah,
a lot of people
exactly.
in self-driving cars, so they're looking
Yeah.
up anyways. So you're good on the slightly longer comment on the billboard, but that's great.
One of the best things we can do is to have conversations with people who see the world differently than us and remind ourselves that the goal is not to convince them that we're right and they're wrong. The goal is to understand what they are trying to tell us and to speak in a way that they can understand us. Great. And what that does is it takes the pressure off of that conversation. I don't have to convince you that to vote for my guy or that your guy's a jerk or to support this issue. All I have to do is understand how you see the world and then speak in a way that you can understand how I see the world. And if we do that, we might not agree with each other, but we'll feel connected to each other.
Final lightning round question. What is the one profile or story that you're itching to write?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. You know, I'm very curious. If I could write any profile, it would be a profile of Barack Obama, because I'm very, very curious, A, how he spends his time now, but B, how he sees the world, right? Particularly with being in the second Trump administration. Some things that Obama did, people seem to identify with, but that's also the mark of when this populist movement started, the start of it. And so I'm very curious what he makes of that and what he makes of his legacy.
Okay. Well, Barack, in the off chance you're listening, first off, I'm honored. Second off, Charles Duhigg would love to profile you for the New Yorker. So as always, our closing question, FranklinCovey is a leadership company. Who is a leader that has greatly influenced you in your life, and what lesson can we all learn from them?
So I think and obviously I didn't know this person firsthand, but Theodore Roosevelt, the life he lived was so unlikely. He was born this sickly child. He lost his wife and his daughter. And yet he somehow found the energy to wake up every day and to go out and try and leave his mark on the world. And that example, I've read a lot of biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, and that example has really been important to me.
That's great. I'm adding a biography of Theodore Roosevelt to the end of my summer reading list now. So leaving with a lot of insights and a great book recommendation. So Charles, thank you so much for joining today. As I said, I have been following your words for the last decade plus. It was an honor to be able to talk today and to learn more from you in person. I hope all of our listeners enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for having me. This has been so much fun.
Wonderful. Awesome. All right. To our listeners, hope you all enjoyed it and hope you join us next week for another episode of FranklinCovey on Leadership. Have a wonderful week.